Think about it, the birth of social media, the rise of AI, the complete, transformation of political talk.
All captured on this one specific date each year.
Precisely. So we're diving deep into four main areas. First, how political conflict and, frankly, lying, how that changed. Second, the push and pull between human creativity and our ever smarter tools.
Third, this sudden realization of how heavy our digital data actually is, the burden of it. And finally, the collective search for meaning, with huge crises like climate change looming.
It sounds comprehensive and, yeah, a bit unnerving, honestly. We're going from midterm election results and why politicians resigned to debates about AI and music or, corporate greenwashing at COP26, what makes something cool, and then these really unsettling projections about authoritarianism maybe creeping closer.
It covers a lot of ground.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's start with that political timeline. It feels like that's where the foundations, maybe the foundations of truth really started to shake. So our political journey kicks off November 6th, 2002. This entry really captures that mid-decade conservative strength, doesn't it?
It does. It notes a big Republican landslide in the congressional elections, a very clear national wave boosting President Bush's mandate after 9/11.
Set the tone for the next few years.
Absolutely. Unilateral power, really. But the source flags something interesting locally in Illinois. Rod Blagojevich became the first Democratic governor there in, 30 years?
Right, I remember that. Seems like a small detail, maybe.
Well, it's crucial because it shows that even when there's this huge national tide going one way, you still have these complex local things happening. Regional politics, personalities, sometimes matter more than the national mood. Anomalies.
Good point. Okay, jump ahead 2 years. November 6th, 2004. The perspective broadens, goes international. And the observation is quite striking. It talks about Europe embracing militant secularism and permissiveness in gay narrative.
Yeah, the source saw that European liberalization as like a necessary vent, a place for progressive ideas to find oxygen, especially while conservatism was really digging in the U.S.
So a counterbalance.
Kind of. There was this almost wistful hope expressed in the entry, a hope for something like the British invasion of '66, a big cultural or political wave coming back across the Atlantic to challenge the American way.
Wow. Okay, hold that thought from 2004. Because the contrast with the projected entry for November 6th, 2025 is, well, it's chilling.
It really is.
It states the exact opposite, basically. Militant Christian nationalism is washing over America, permissiveness in the authoritarian narrative. It's a perfect flip 20 years later.
A mirror image, almost, but darker. It suggests those forces found an even stronger foothold in the U.S. by 2025. Just shows how incredibly volatile political identity has become.
That volatility, it's right there in the next entry too, isn't it? November 6, 2006, the resignation of Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense.
Yes, right after a pretty bad midterm election for the Republicans.
And the reason noted was the Iraq War criticism, right? A need for a fresh perspective, institutionally recognized. Bush, despite supporting him initially, accepted the resignation.
And that's a critical point the source highlights. Back in 2006, the system, maybe painfully, maybe slowly, still had these accountability mechanisms. Performance, public pressure, bipartisan criticism, they mattered. Bush made a necessary change.
Okay, so compare that. Compare that 2006 situation to the pattern described later in the source material, the one about dictatorships and strongmen.
Right. The fundamental difference is how power handles incompetence, or even just disagreement.
How so?
In the pattern the source describes later, the newer model isn't about competence. It's not about qualifications or independent advice. It's about absolute loyalty and submission, full stop.
So competence doesn't matter if you're not seen as totally loyal.
Exactly. The moment you seem disloyal, even if you're the best person for the job, you're out. Purged. The whole point is to stop any internal check on the leader's power, their ideology.
You end up creating this echo chamber, right? Expert advice from, say, the military, CIA, State Department. It's useless unless it confirms what the leader already believes.
It just gets ignored or rejected. And the consequences, well, they can be devastating. The source calls it arrogant incompetence. It's not just bad decisions. It's systemic failure. It happens because people lower down are too scared to tell the truth, to deliver the bad news, the non-conforming data, up the chain.
Because loyalty is everything.
Exactly. So in a crisis foreign policy, a pandemic, whatever the system protects the leader's ego first, not public safety or strategic success. It inevitably leads to massive failures.
This acceptance of failure, or maybe the cause of it, brings us to November 6, 2012. The diarist calls this a new benchmark for Republican mendacity.
Mendacity. Just habitual lying, right?
Yes, but it's more than just lying. It's weaponized. It's a tactic. The source lays out this like three-step process for modern misinformation.
Okay, what are the steps?
First, you make outrageous, often totally false statements. Just flood the zone. Second, you force your opposition, the media, academics, the other party, to spend all their time and energy trying to disprove your lie.
Exhaust them, basically. And what's the end goal? It can't be to actually convince everyone of the lie, surely. Not necessarily. The goal is twofold, it seems. One, you achieve what the source calls manufactured consent. People just get tired of the denials, they tune out, or they start to think, well, maybe there's something to it, or they just stop caring. Two, and maybe this is more insidious, you create generalized cynicism. The public just stops believing anything is true. If everything seems like a lie, then objective reality disappears, and that chaos. It benefits the side that relies on emotion, on narrative, not facts.
That 2012 entry also mentioned Obama's re-election and linked it to the fourth turning. Can you briefly explain that idea for listeners?
Sure. The fourth turning is this theory of history, cyclical history.
Yeah.
It argues that societies go through these roughly 80 to 100-year cycles, and each cycle ends in a massive crisis, a period of upheaval. That's the fourth turning.
And the diarists in 2012 thought Obama's win might be the start of Chapter 1 of that final crisis period.
Yeah, defining or completing Chapter 1 of the revolution, as the theory puts it.
Which makes the 2024 entry even more disturbing. By November 6, 2024, the source says mendacity is too nice of a word.
It gets much harsher. The diarist suggests the fourth turning wasn't just being observed by some people, it was actively being used. Appropriated as a playbook to actually make the crisis happen, to force events through sheer political will, and accelerating the breakdown it predicted.
Wow. Using a theory of collapse to engineer collapse.
That's the implication. And that connects directly to the psychology. The projection for November 6, 2025, it digs into this prompt. What are the primary reasons people don't like Democrats?
And the answers suggested are kind of brutal.
They are. Basically, a perceived inability to deliver effectively, even with big policies like Obamacare. And maybe deeper than that, this almost primal preference for personality over policy.
Personality over policy.
Yeah. The source knows voters will prioritize personally liking a candidate. Why? Because they're fun and entertaining and not a bore. It leads to this terrifying idea that maybe humans aren't really built for truth. Maybe we're just easily conned.
And this preference for entertainment, for personality, that's what drives tabloid postmodernist politics.
That's the term the source uses.
Yes.
And the media landscape, it fuels it. That the 1162 Daily 24 entry has this shocking statistic. YouTube got more watch time on Election Day than any other platform.
YouTube. More than news channels.
More than anything. Think about it. A platform optimized for viral, emotional, often unvetted content becomes the main place people get political info right before they vote. It's basically an engine for consuming propaganda.
So where does this lead? The 2025 projection sounds grim.
It's deeply pessimistic if you follow the trends the diarist saw accelerating. The conclusion is that the system, the political system, is fundamentally broken by this division, by this mendacity.
So even if one side, say Democrats, wins more votes,
the source says it means almost nothing in a real authoritarian takeover scenario, because the rules, the electoral systems, they've been rigged or just dismantled enough to make popular will irrelevant.
And the specific details in that 2025 projection, they're unsettling. A long government shutdown, day 37 is mentioned, firing federal workers based on loyalty tests.
Yeah, but the most alarming detail, I think, is the projection of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, invading and occupying Chicago, using tear gas in quiet communities.
That suggests more than just political gridlock.
It's a breakdown of federal-state relations. It's a visible projection of domestic authoritarian force, a slow-motion system failure, really, cemented by accepting lies as the dominant way to do politics. It shows how that arrogant incompetence and weaponized mendacity lead to real, tangible societal breakdown.
Okay, so if the political backdrop is this place where truth is, let's say, negotiable, how does that affect culture? Art, creativity. Where does creativity go when reality itself feels subjective? Let's look at how we consume things, starting November 6, 2016.
Right, that 2016 entry points to this fragmentation of shared culture. The diarist noticed that new music from 1971, like 45 years earlier, felt more culturally significant than new movies coming out in 2016.
More potent. How so?
People were apparently willing to wait for new films to show up on TV, even with commercials. Cinema just wasn't grabbing the collective attention the way it used to, or maybe the way older music still could.
Interesting. Finding more nutrition, as the source puts it, in the past. And then there's this prediction about access. The next step beyond streaming is streaming ad-free internet.
Yeah, it's sort of the logical endpoint, isn't it? Seamless consumption, no ads, no friction. But the really big disruptor for creativity, tackled on November 6, 2020, is AI, artificial intelligence.
Yes, AI. The initial take in 2020 was skeptical, though.
Very skeptical, especially about music.
Yeah.
The entry flat out asserts AI will not change music fundamentally, not like multi-track recording did, or MIDI.
Why that distinction? What made multi-track and MIDI fundamental in a way AI wasn't back then?
Well, things like multi-track and MIDI, they changed the actual language of music creation. They let people manipulate time, layer sounds, control instruments in totally new ways. They literally enabled new genres to exist. The 2020 view is that AI, at that point, felt more like a really sophisticated pattern generator, maybe. Not an engine for inventing a whole new musical vocabulary. Tools assist creativity, the source argues. They don't eliminate it.
Right. And the source brings up that classic artist's dilemma, spending all your time perfecting the tools, collecting the gear, learning the software, instead of actually making stuff.
Exactly. That abeyance of the creative work. It's the trap of endlessly refining your setup. You get really good at following the recipe, maybe,
Right.
but you might just keep getting the same results.
Whereas real creativity is more messy.
Discovery, accidents sometimes. The Force notes this real fear of regret. I wish I would have made something with all those tools, that tension between being a technologist and being an artist.
But things change fast, especially with AI. Fast forward to the November 6th, 2025 projection.
And the tone is completely different. What a difference 5 years makes. Suddenly, there's an acknowledgement of the intellectual sophistication of using AI.
So it's not just pushing buttons anymore.
Apparently not. The idea of a happy medium, using both as hybrids, comes up. Collaboration, not just automation. The source even mentions a Reddit post, which suggests people are actively grappling with this. How does human authorship work with AI? The question shifted from, is it cheating, to, how do we use this creatively?
Okay, interesting shift. Now let's talk about looking backwards, nostalgia, and this idea of cool. November 6th, 2021, the entry notes, people digging into old genres, shoegaze, 90s stuff, finding it on obscure sites. Why?
The source calls it a sign that musical nutrition has really gone missing. People were searching for authenticity, for originality that they weren't finding in the mainstream, maybe.
Like going back to find the source code.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Like cultural backward compatibility. The source uses a software analogy going back to an old version of Photoshop, like version 2 or 7. By going back, you rediscover what felt genuinely new then, before it got layered over with iterations.
Which makes being cool now really hard.
Yeah.
The November 6th, 2022 entry says, trying to be cool online today often feels stale. Like an old joke.
Yeah, like watching a forgotten 50s musical. It's the comparison used. The edge is gone. Or maybe the reference points are just exhausted.
But the idea of cool doesn't die, does it? The source says it's archetypal.
Right. It taps into something deeper. Jungian archetypes, like the magician or the trickster. Figures who operate outside the rules, who transform things, who disrupt. That energy, that archetype, is what we recognize as cool.
And this connects to David Bowie and postmodernism ending.
Yeah, the source brings up Bowie's prediction that the door was closing on postmodernism. You know, postmodernism being that cultural mode of skepticism, that mixing high and low culture, irony.
Our dominant mode for decades, really.
Exactly. And the source points to a specific example. Steve Lacy's SNL performance on November 6th, 2022, described as 70s retro redolent of 1976 top 40.
So people are doing nostalgia trips looking back.
Actively looking back, maybe trying to grab onto that pre-postmodern cool before the whole thing runs out of steam. A kind of cultural rummaging.
And even the legal system reflects this postmodern hangover. There is a mention of the Warhol Prince Supreme Court case from November 6th, 2022.
Right. That case was all about fair use, appropriation. How much do you have to change something before it becomes new art? And Warhol, the king of appropriation, is like the ghost in the machine there.
Yeah.
The underlying idea is still anything continues to go with anything. That's pure postmodern philosophy.
But the diarist pushes back a bit, right? Saying that true postmodernism should avoid repetition. But when you look back 20 or 30 years...
You just see patterns repeating. Neo something or post something. It suggests maybe postmodernism never truly ends. It just keeps rebranding itself. Like a zombie ideology.
Huh. The cultural version of political mendacity, maybe? Shifting language, same structure.
That's an interesting parallel. And finally, just to ground the creativity discussion, November 6th, 2023, makes this really specific point about melody.
Melody?
Yeah, that it's fundamentally auditory. You hear it. It doesn't need to be seen, even though we have notation for pitch and rhythm. It just underscores that Different art forms, like music versus photography, work on totally different sensory and material levels.
Okay, let's shift from art and ideas to something very concrete, or at least something that feels concrete, our digital lives. Specifically, the surprising weight of all this data we're creating.
Yeah, this is a big theme emerging around November 6, 2021. It starts with a personal story in the diary, a hard drive crash.
We've all been there.
Right. And the diarist had this philosophy of being anti-objects, trying to avoid physical stuff, books, art, because it needed storing, cataloging. The plan was switch everything to digital stuff, right?
Famous last words.
Exactly. The crash forces this realization.
Yeah.
Data is an actual object, too. You still have to lug it around, manage it, backups, cloud storage, organizing it. It's not weightless.
It has a different kind of weight.
A heaviness, yeah. And it's not just storage, it's the time. The source mentions the hours and hours it takes just to go through your own data. It replaces physical clutter with this massive ongoing time commitment.
And it's not just the time, it's whether the data is even useful.
That's the killer point, also from 2021. There's this example. A huge Facebook data download from 2018. Sounds valuable, right? Your digital life. But the source says it's totally useless. For writing a memoir, for future historians, compared to, say, organized diaries or structured notes in Evernote, that Facebook dump is just chaos. No context, no structure, no narrative, just a massive, undifferentiated blob of information.
Wow. So we're creating history like never before, but in a format that might be impossible to interpret later.
That's the fear. The source states it directly.
Yeah.
Society needs an overarching philosophy for dealing with this data deluge. We're just generating it without thinking about its long-term usability.
And this leads to a prediction about future jobs.
Yeah, a fascinating one. Data is so huge, we need data scientists to handle the sheer volume. But data scientists aren't historians. They don't necessarily have the skills for critical analysis, context, narrative. So the prediction is the data scientist and the historian will be one and the same. A new kind of hybrid professional has to emerge, someone who gets the tech and the history.
That makes sense. This whole issue, managing data, trusting information, it loops right back into the political mess, doesn't it? Especially the internet's structure.
Absolutely. On November 6, 2023, the source talks about the appeal of a federated internet, even a diary federation using standardized metadata.
Okay, what does federated internet or semantic web actually mean? Sounds kind of old school Web 1.0.
It is, in spirit. It's about using agreed-upon standards, metadata, data about data to add layers of structure and trust. Information gets tagged, verified, linked logically, so systems and people can better understand where information comes from and what it means. More transparency.
Compared to what we have now.
Which, the source says, became shadowy and anonymous around 2011. That anonymity was a tipping point. It made it super easy to spread dark opinions without accountability, and for misinformation campaigns to hide their tracks, shift narratives instantly.
Which brings us to maybe the most powerful concept here, the wet text problem. From November 6th, 2024, what is wet text?
Okay, this is fundamental. Think about text on the internet, a web page, a tweet, an online statement. It's always wet. It can be changed, edited, deleted, updated instantly, often without a trace. It lacks permanence.
Okay, like ink that never dries.
Exactly. But here's the problem. The source argues we treat this constantly changing, mutable, wet text as if it has the authority and permanence of printed text, like a public book or a daily newspaper from the past. Fixed, verifiable.
And the danger there is, if the basic record, the facts, can just be altered.
Consensus reality collapses. It enables the very mendacity we talked about earlier. If you can rewrite the past for the present, accountability disappears. Shared ground vanishes.
The source blames this disconnect treating wet text like dry ink for the current political chaos.
Directly. It's seen as a fundamental misunderstanding of the medium and the suggested fix. Amending Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996.
Section 230, that's the one that protects online platforms from liability for user content, right? How would changing that help?
The argument in the source is that if platforms had some responsibility for the unchecked, harmful misinformation they host, they'd be incentivized to moderate better, to be more transparent about sources, maybe even to create systems that track changes, creating verifiable records dealing with a witness problem, trying to inject some accountability back into the digital public square.
All right, let's shift gears again to maybe the biggest challenge of all, climate change. How is this being viewed through the lens of these entries? Let's look at COP26 from November 6th, 2021.
Yeah, that entry really nails the cognitive dissonance around climate action. It describes reading a serious article about the COP26 negotiations, only to have this huge Walmart pop-up ad appear. And the ad is boasting about Walmart working with thousands of suppliers to avoid, like, 1 gigaton of emissions by 2030.
The irony is pretty thick there.
It's the core contradiction, right? Walmart symbolizes the very model of endless growth that the source says we can't have if we're serious about the climate.
So the market-based solutions, the corporate pledges, they feel inadequate.
Deeply inadequate. The source argues that even so-called sustainable growth still relies heavily on fossil fuels, and avoiding 1 gigaton while global consumption keeps soaring. It's rearranging deck chairs. The skepticism about official targets is strong. 2050 for carbon neutral. Unlikely. Maybe 2070, the source suggests, and even that feels insufficient.
There's also a warning about infrastructure, isn't there? About phasing out fossil fuels too quickly.
Yes, a really critical point. It's the stability problem. We need to get off fossil fuels, obviously. But if we dismantle the existing power grid, the reliable coal and gas plants too fast, before renewables are truly ready to handle peak demand.
What happens then?
Well, think about heat waves, which are getting worse. Air conditioning demand spikes. Right now, the only way to meet that sudden surge reliably is often by firing up those old fossil fuel plants. If they're gone, and the renewables aren't robust enough yet, you risk catastrophic blackouts.
Which could force a panic return to coal or gas anyway.
Exactly, undermining the whole transition. And tied to this rush is quality. The source argues that the sheer speed needed now for the global renewable rollout means the quality's not going to be there.
Cutting corners because we waited too long.
Precisely. We're rushing because we didn't make the serious investments back in the 70s or 80s. So now, the systems we're building under pressure might not be durable or reliable enough for the long haul. Speed compromises quality, potentially jeopardizing the goal itself.
Okay, so faced with these huge, complex problems, climate change, political breakdown, how does the source see people coping psychologically? There's a mention on November 6, 2022, of a resurgence in higher consciousness ideas.
Yes. Specifically looking back to the late 1980s, remember the interest in Carl Jung archetypes, Joseph Campbell, Robert Bly, the men's movement stuff.
Vaguely, yeah. Myths, archetypes.
That whole wave. The source sees it cycling back. Figures like Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan are positioned as sort of elders from that time, repackaging that circa 1988 content, often simplified, for a new generation feeling lost and anxious.
Looking for meaning, for structure.
Exactly. The source even mentions philosopher John Vervaeke's work on sense-making, and his reference to the Bronze Age collapse as a kind of historical wink to our own precarious moment.
But there's a critical edge, too, about commercialization.
Definitely. It points to figures like Marianne Williamson or Caroline Musk creating good profit centers, charging hefty fees for courses, guidance, workshops.
So turning existential angst into an industry.
That's the critique. It's seen as rooted in that 60s and 90s individualism focusing on self-discovery, individual fulfillment, which is fine, but archetypes are fundamentally collective. Yet the movement often markets itself as individual solutions, potentially profiting from the very fragmentation it claims to heal.
This critique of individualism gets sharper with Caroline Miss's analysis, also from 11/6/2022. She argues that the whole 60s idea of just going off on our own is bad.
Anathema to human nature is the phrase used. Miss, drawing on Jung's hero's journey, argues you can only really pursue the self constructively after you've had enough guidance, enough structure on how to manage the self within a community. Otherwise, radical, unmoored individualism just leads to fragmentation. It weakens collective wisdom and makes society vulnerable to tribalism.
And tribalism, according to the November 6th, 2024 entry, is fundamentally incompatible with truth.
Yeah, the assertion is blunt. A tribe can't take the truth. Any fact or idea that challenges the tribe's core narrative, whether it's historical evidence about Jesus or a politician needing to apologize for the Iraq War, it gets instantly twisted, converted into propaganda, spin. The source says there's absolutely no way a tribe can be reasoned with, because its identity is built on the narrative, not on objective reality.
Which connects back to Jung's ideas about evil, right? From the 2024 entry.
It does. The source uses Jung's analysis of Nazi Germany's rise. Jung argued it wasn't just about external factors. It was a failure within German society to confront its own shadow, the repressed, dark parts of the collective psyche.
So the evil wasn't dealt with, just projected.
Exactly. Transferred onto an external enemy. And Jung's warning, echoed chillingly in the source, is that the shadow doesn't disappear. It just finds a new host. The source concludes, it will go somewhere else and it's come here. We are the new host. The failure to manage individualism, the rejection of truth, makes a society fertile ground for that collective shadow to take root again.
That's a heavy thought. Finally, linking the individual back to this collective dynamic, there's the idea of word constellations from November 6th, 2022.
Right. This is about personal identity. The idea is if you recorded everything you said for a week, the words you repeat, the metaphors you use, your specific phrasing, that pattern forms your word identity. And those constellations aren't just talk. They actually shape your worldview, your filter on reality.
Which means if political actors or propaganda consistently use certain word constellations, hammering specific definitions of freedom or patriotism or enemy,
they're tapping directly into the underlying structure of how people think. It bypasses rational argument and speaks to that pre-existing worldview, making people highly receptive to the spin the mendacity we started with.
So the micro level of individual language fuels the macro level of political belief and tribalism.
It ties it all together. The psychological anxiety feeds the political reality, and vice versa.
Okay, wow. So after tracing all these threads, where does that leave us? We've definitely covered a lot of ground tracing this really aggressive, often unsettling arc through these November 6th snapshots. We saw political lies morph from a tactic into almost an accepted myth, prioritizing loyalty over actual competence, leading to these, quite frankly, scary projections for 2025.
Yeah, and at the same time, culture grappling with these incredibly powerful new tools like AI, while also sort of desperately looking backwards to the 70s, the 90s, even the 80s Jungian stuff, searching for some kind of authentic nutrition.
Right. And underneath it all, this growing weight, this burden of our own digital history, data that's so overwhelming, so potentially unusable, we risk kind of losing the plot of our own story.
It highlights this core tension, doesn't it? We have this deep human urge to go back, to find stability in older ideas, archetypes, music, whatever feels solid, but we're constantly pushed forward by technology, by the sheer volume of data, by crises like climate change demanding new solutions. It's the past versus the future, fixed truth versus wet text.
That wet text idea really sticks. The internet's text is always changeable, unreliable in a way. Yet history, civilization itself, kind of depends on having fixed points, verifiable truths, manageable records. So if the future really requires this merger, the historian becoming a data scientist, the data scientist becoming a historian to make sense of this flood, we have to end with a question for you, the listener. It's a provocative one. What specific things, ethical rules, technological standards, maybe even laws do we need to put in place right now, today, to make sure the colossal amount of data we're creating, our digital diaries, our online arguments, our entire recorded history, is actually usable for finding historical truth down the road? How do we stop it from just becoming this giant, unmanageable archive of shadows, lies, and constantly shifting, untrustworthy wet text?